My videos usually focus on small decorative objects like bowls and boxes, but today I'm going to talk about something very different. A kitchen table that I'm building with my partner Joe to meet a need that we couldn't fulfill in any other way but making it ourselves. The situation was that we needed a table that would comfortably seat 4 people, and the usual 3 foot by 3 foot table that you get at counter height made for smaller spaces just was not big enough. We also wanted a table that was made out of cherry to match a very lovely set of cherry chairs that we had from the place that we used to live. So we decided we would make it ourselves. We wanted the top to be practical, since this wasn't the kind of table that you want to have to drag out a tablecloth for or be worried about protecting, and that pretty well eliminated a wood top, since we would be making it out of a nice wood that would have to be protected. So we decided to make a table with a tile top. As we looked at available plans, we found that there were between 0 and none that were useful for our purposes. The tile top tables tended to involve little mosaics, or were instructions on how to tile over an existing table for use for outdoors, but nothing elegant. We went to various furniture places that had tile top tables and found, first of all, that tile top tables did not exist with the nicer lines of furniture. And the ones that we found were, the tile was caulked and looked like you would imagine something that belonged in your bathroom, not in your kitchen. So we figured we would figure out how to do it ourselves, and here's what we did. We used a mortise and tenon construction that Joe has used for leather top desks, and the mortise, which looks very shallow with a little tenon here, really doesn't show you that what we used was a haunched tenon, so that the top part is shallow, the first part, but it goes much deeper into the leg. We didn't want to compromise the leg too much because we were concerned about the weight of the tile, and this seemed like a good solution, and this was done all around. We decided to brace the table, not necessary when you're using a regular wooden top, by putting in cross braces, again with mortise and tenon construction. I'll tell you more about these little things that you're probably wondering about here in a moment. And corner bracing, following the suggestion of Ian Kirby, who uses corner braces and says to set them below the level of the apron. He sets them way below. We couldn't figure out why, but we decided to set it somewhat below. This sort of guarantees that it will not go higher than the top of the apron. And it's done in a kind of a T formation so that the top part of it is wider and allows you to screw into the top part of the table. This gives us the flexibility where if at some point down the road we don't want a tile top, we can remove this and reuse the base. The reason for these little blocks here was that we wanted to secure the plywood. We're using a 3/4 inch furniture grade plywood. I'll show you the top of this later on in the video. And we figured that would probably be stable enough, but we wanted to attach it other than just the corners. The alternative to using these, which are glue blocks that are drilled through, countersunk on the lower side, would be to drill a counterboard hole up through the bottom so that you could use a screw that wasn't 17 inches long to get to the tabletop. But we didn't want to compromise the wood. So this, although it looks weird, no one will see it, and it really is kind of neat. They're glue blocks, they seem to be pretty strong, and yes, if you hit them with a hammer, they probably fracture off, but don't hit it with a hammer. So that we anticipate that this should give the strength and the stability needed to support the tabletop, which looks like a framing panel. It was constructed a little differently, which I'll explain later, and will be loaded with about 40 pounds of tile. We have them numbered and ready to go. a porcelain tile, nice substantial tile, that will be attaching in a conventional manner. So the frame has been finished. We decided to assemble it here because this is the room in which it's going to be used. So the wood has a chance to acclimate to where it's going to be, and we won't have to carry the heavy table up. The top is currently in process in the garage. So we'll go over to the garage now. The reason we use the garage is that the stain is a smell you would not want in your kitchen. In your garage, it doesn't matter. We can open the garage door. So we'll take a look at that top, and I'll explain how we're making it. So let's go take a look in the garage. One of the reasons I'm smiling is that it took us a long time and a lot of thought to reach the point where we actually have the top almost ready to use. Let me point out some of the things that may not be apparent. The first problem we faced was cutting the plywood to size. Since we didn't have many facilities for this, we don't generally use plywood. We generally use hardwood, not sheet goods. But we needed to get a good cut, a good precise cut, to take the trim. Although this looks like a frame and panel construction, it's not. This is actually a large piece of back banding that Joe cut out of a piece of cherry by cutting a rabbet into it of the appropriate size so that the tile, when installed, will reach the top of this. In order to do that, I actually attached a piece of tile to a scrap of the plywood, and we measured it to make sure we got it right the first time. The reason that we didn't go with a frame and panel is that we wanted to have maximum support under the tile, and the plywood goes all the way up to here. There's only a ½ inch of wood that comes down here. It looks beefy. If you look underneath, though, you see the plywood, and the plywood rests on the legs as well as the other supports. So if that doesn't hold it, I give up. One of our friends looked at the understructure of the table and said that you could probably land a large plane on it without any trouble. That was the train, not the plane. Anyway, in order to cut the plywood, we built a support. This is made out of pieces of 2x4 running across, and it lets you control the sheet goods very nicely. And it's resting on these really very nice sawhorses that Joe built that are surprisingly sturdy. They're complete with through wedge tenons. They're really very elegant. And with a little adjustment, they formed a platform for this table. So we had a sturdy surface on which to cut it, and our cuts came within a 1/16 of an inch of what we wanted, and all our corners were square, which is nothing short of miraculous, given that we were using a reconditioned $40 circular saw, but it worked. Before we glued this on and started the finishing process, we wanted to make sure that our tiles would go where they had to be. Since you have a perimeter all around it, any irregularities will show up and look really ugly. So that we lay the tiles out with spacers. We made sure that there were even borders around the edges of each of the tiles, which will be filled with grout. And we marked the center tile, and when we tile it, we're going to do it in a cross first, and that will set the tiles, and then we'll fill them with squares, and I think that probably should work. So all our guidelines were done before things were put into place, and then we attached the trim with clamps before we did any gluing to make sure that there were no major adjustments. Now, of course, when you make a frame, your corners will never come out absolutely perfectly, but ours turned out better than we had hoped. Joe used a jig with a table saw to cut the miters, which was quite precise. But given that we were dealing with edges of plywood, this was not the degree of precision that you'd need. I came up with a solution to fill the minute gaps in the miters and also the little bit of chip outs when we stopped using the tape as we were supposed to after taking the 10th cut of shaving things away. Next time we will put the tape down because it really did make a difference. As I was sanding, I put a very little bit of glue wherever there were spaces, and I sanded so that the dust was able to go into these small openings. I was concerned that it would look discolored when we finally put one coat of stain on it after sealing it up with a shellac wash coat. So I took a toothpick and moved just the very top of it so that it was filled to eliminate spaces, but there was nothing showing on top. And the miters look almost flawless. We were really very pleased with the way it came out. Since this is cherry, before we put on a stain, which tends to blotch on cherry, we gave it a wash coat of shellac, and that was sanded down. We used a 320 grit sandpaper. And then we let that dry. And when we put on the coat of stain, we used a coat of Minwax cherry stain, which actually is a very nice color match for the cherry chairs that we had. And this now has a wash coat over the stain. And once this is thoroughly dry, we'll rub it down and give it several coats of thinned poly, because we felt that poly would be needed for the extra protection for a tabletop. The shellac with the moisture and everything just would not be appropriate. Once the several coats of poly have been put on and then rubbed down, then we're going to bring this back in. We'll install it on top of the frame, making sure that it's even all around. And then the table is virtually completed, only awaiting the tile, so that by the time the tile goes on, all of the woodworking will have been completed. Once the table was assembled, we drew guidelines on the plywood to make sure the tiles would be straight when we attached them. I made many trips back and forth from one side of the table to the other to ensure that the spacing was even where the tiles met the wood. It was a painstaking process, but absolutely necessary, since once they were attached, there would be no second chances. Since we knew that the guidelines would be obscured to some extent by the mortar, we decided to use a wooden guide for the first row. To set it, we used the pencil lines that we had previously drawn. The wood was secured with double-sided tape, which was strong enough to hold it securely, but easy enough to remove once the tile was set. When everything was ready, I applied the mortar with a trowel. The tiles were mortared into place, each in a predetermined location, and spaced 1/4 inch apart. We were too busy applying the grout to take a video of the process. The 3-part epoxy grout we used was demanding, but we followed the instructions to the letter and ended up with both smooth joints and clean tiles. That evening, I enjoyed a well-earned nap after dinner, satisfied that the table we set out to build had been completed to our satisfaction. And here we have it, our beautiful finished table. As you can see, our careful measurement paid off. The perimeter where the tile meets the back banding is even, which was tricky to achieve and the result of all of our measuring. the grout lines on the rest of the table are even thanks to the little spacers. That worked out fine. The tile meets the wood at just the right height. It's ever so slightly elevated, which is just what we wanted. And that we achieved by doing testing, by actually using the mortar with the tile on a piece of the plywood and making sure that we cut the back banding, the rabbet, to exactly the right depth. And that paid off big time. Our miters look beautiful, which is a little bonus since we know our critical friends are likely to look at the miters first. And as you can see, it will blend very nicely with the cherry chairs once it's had a chance to age a bit. We had stained it ever so slightly just to start the darkening process. But the nicest thing about the table is that it's just the right size. We left this bare so that you could see we weren't trying to hide any ugly spots. But let me show you what I mean. Since there are just the two of us for most of the meals, the table works very nicely for two people. It's not overly large, and there's a generous area for a newspaper or condiments or serving dishes. That works very nicely. But the main reason that we made the table was to be able to entertain friends in the kitchen when the dining room really was not called for. And that little table that we had used, which was about 38 inches square, just simply was not big enough. So we went shopping for some placemats that would blend and not compete with the tile. And after a little hunting, we found them. And as you can see, it's perfect for 4 people. Not generous, but if you have people over for coffee or for brunch and don't want to do a formal setup, or for cocktails, it's absolutely right. And you can't get a good quality table anywhere with a tile top in this size. It just doesn't exist. And at the counter height, which incidentally many people who have trouble getting up from low chairs find very convenient. So it's not exactly a geriatric aid, but if you have older people over and are concerned that they may feel awkward on this, it's actually a very nice and comfortable height. And if you go to the trouble of making a good table, do yourself a favor and get decent chairs to go with it, and then you really have a beautiful, high-quality little dinette set. Thanks for watching the video, and we hope that this inspires you to make your own beautiful tile top table.